Hello again. We have the honor to have today with us Dr. Marissa Stevens from the University of California, Los Angeles, from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. She's going to talk to us about the functional veneration, the incorporation of ancestors in private art of the Third Intermediate Period. So, this is for you, like that's you now, Dr. Stevens. You can share your screen with us and you can start.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm going to do the entire screen method, so it's going to look a little strange for a minute, but hopefully it all works out in the end. Okay, so now everyone should see just my PowerPoint, I'm hoping. Is that correct? Okay, thank you so much. And thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm so sorry that I couldn't be there in person, but I'm so grateful that I'm able to present virtually at this conference. And it's my hope with this talk that I can highlight some of the more practical or profane reasons one might choose to venerate or even deify an ancestor.
Excuse me, Dr. Stevens.
Yes?
Think that there's something here that says you're sharing your entire screen, like an indication. So this doesn't have to show. So hide it, please.
Oh, okay. All right.
Thank you.
How's that?
Yeah.
That work? Okay, great.
Let's go.
Perfect. Yeah, so why they might choose to venerate or even deify an ancestor within the context of the ancient Egyptian religious system. And so my research centers on issues of identity, particularly in times of crisis and decentralization, such as the Third Intermediate Period. Now, I've observed time and time again that when social structures that order a society are in jeopardy, so too are individual identities. Individuals must, during this time, get creative in terms of how they can continue to navigate their communities, social hierarchies, and political worlds. Some individuals might only be able to cling to power and authority, whereas others are able not just to maintain, but also advance their positions in society. And oftentimes religion is used as a tool to achieve these ends. And this is exactly the situation that we see in the Third Intermediate Period, and in particular the 21st dynasty, which saw a crippled and truncated royal lineage hold power in Tanis and the high priest of Amun take control of the south. Now, this set the stage for the remainder of the Third Intermediate Period, where dynastic observations where dynastic factions and groups of priests lobbied for control over parts of Egypt. Now, I wish to highlight several observations unique to the Ramessid period transition that set the stage for the Third Intermediate Period that followed as it pertains to the priesthood, economic power of the temples, and in some instances, veneration and deification of ancestors for political and economic gain. Now, during most of the early New Kingdom, the Karnak temple complex was staffed by administrators and priests who also held other positions outside the temple in the broader Theban area. Throughout the New Kingdom, the positions available within the temple became increasingly differentiated, but these positions were distributed by kings to palace officials and were not at the time considered to be hereditary positions by nature. Now, officials often held positions within the palace and military administrations as well as the priesthood, and as a result, the temple positions were often de-emphasized in favor of elevated positions elsewhere in the Egyptian government. A shift during the Ramessid period, however, took place, which can be witnessed in the titles and personages recorded in private tombs in the New Kingdom. There's a marked shift from palace titles to temple titles with added emphasis on family relationships. So for elite Theban tombs of the 18th dynasty, 71% of titles of the tomb owner referenced a relationship to the king or an affiliation to the palace. 29% of the titles focused on the temple. But for the Ramessid period tombs from Thebes, this statistic almost flips, with 22% of titles relating to the king or the palace administration, and 78% of titles refer to the temple, and hints at the decreasing authority of the king over the elite and the state temple system, to which so many of the elite population were affiliated. These New Kingdom elite tombs also reveal an increased number of relatives represented in the tomb. Again, this demonstrates the desire of the Theban elite in the Ramessid period to highlight meaningful connections outside the realm of kingship to define oneself. Only 33% of 18th dynasty tombs had at least one named relative with titles. And for the Ramessid period, this percentage jumps to 76%. The average number of relatives mentioned in 18th dynasty tombs, either with or without titles, is 3, whereas there's an average of 8.5 mentioned relatives per the Ramessid period tombs. So what do these two trends indicate? Well, in my opinion, it's an overall recognition that the palace during the Ramessid period is beginning to destabilize, and that the Theban elite have a better chance of maintaining their social status, not through a connection to the king, but through the temple. Thus, elite families begin to renegotiate the importance of their own family structures and develop hereditary positions of power that took power away from the throne. By the decline of royal power at the end of the 20th dynasty, it was clear that less social benefit could be derived from political and military positions. Thus, it appears that more individuals turned to temple titles as a source of prestige. With this increased importance in temple positions came the motivation to preserve these titles through the generations and focus on hereditary possibilities of these positions. So take, for example, Ramses Nocht, who was priest in Karnak and a sem-priest in Medinet Habu, first under the reign of Ramses VI, and he continued in his position until Ramses IX, when his sons succeeded him in both positions. So Ramses Nocht's father also served as a sem-priest at Medinet Habu, meaning the inheritance of these temple positions spanned at least 3 generations and lasted for over 50 years. This pattern and others like it set the precedence for the 21st dynasty for the inheritance of temple titles that prevailed during this decentralized time period. This hereditary tradition is also reflected in the texts of the statue of Bassa, shown here, and stylistically and genealogically, this is dated to the 22nd or 23rd dynasties. Bassa chronicles 19 generations of family in the priesthood, including his ancestor, the high priest of Amun-Nebwenenef, who was selected for his office by an oracle, not by the king. The statue of Bassa is thus a monument to priestly families that installed their positions via the god themselves, via this oracle. And so this emphasis on hereditary temple titles leads me to the main focus of my research, which is 21st dynasty funerary papyri from the priestly families of Thebes. These documents record a wealth of information about the deceased and their extended families, in addition to the funerary religious knowledge they contain. So looking at the numbers, there are 559 known 21st dynasty funerary papyri dispersed among several secure archaeological contexts and unprovenanced locations. Of these 559 papyri, 139 include identified family members of the deceased in the preserved text. So thus, the inclusion of identified family members on funerary papyri seems to have not been a necessity, as what was the case with other types of papyri, like oracular amuletic decrees, but rather an optional component utilized to identify socially the deceased. Now, most owners of funerary papyri are preserved by name and title, and women utilize 24 distinct titles, and men have 97 different temple positions. I want to turn to some of these titles first and analyze them to understand in a more complete way how family was represented on these documents and utilized for social standing. So I would first like to divide the owners of papyri into 2 main groups: those with higher ranking titles and those with standard titles. And I completely understand that this is at times a subjective judgment, but the overall range of titles surveyed in the 21st dynasty reveal clear distinctions, I think, between more standard titles and those that are more prestigious. So for example, Mistress of the House and Enchantress of Amun are the 2 most standard titles for women, but Chief Singer and Chief Priestess positions are much more rare and constitute, I think, higher ranking titles. For men, the obvious title is that of the High Priest of Amun. Other high-ranking titles involve being the overseer of certain temple works, holding numerically ranked temple titles, or acting in an administrative capacity within the temple. And standard titles for men would involve being a Wab priest or a Hemnetra priest. So 32 men with high-ranking titles include family members on their papyri. Of these individuals, 24 have at least one family member with provided titles. And compare this to the 44 men with standard titles, of which only 18 include titles for at least one family member. There are 10 cases where high-ranking women list the titles of a husband, father, or paternal grandfather. And this is out of a total group of 15 high-ranking women. And just like for men, women with standard titles are much less likely to list family members with titles of their own. What is interesting here is that women tend to focus almost exclusively on the titles of their male relatives. I'd like to provide some examples now, the first of which is the papyrus of Mistress of the House, Chantress of Amun, Chief Singer in the Choir of Mut, Tayu Herit, who lists her father, Konsumes, in this example from her papyrus as a godfather of Amun and an overseer of monuments in Karnak. Now, elsewhere, she describes her father as a scribe in the house of Mut, the chief scribe in the house of Amun-Re, the overseer of the house of gold of Amun-Re, and the overseer of the house of silver of Amun-Re. What's interesting is she also names her mother, Tanit Amun, including her titles of Mistress of the House and Chantress of Amun. Now, Tayu's inclusion of her father's titles makes sense in terms of firmly situating her family amongst her peers of the Theban elite. But I would suggest that the interesting choice of including her mother's titles is so that she can showcase her own social climb. After all, not only did she hold the positions that her mother held, she was also a chief singer in the choir of Mut, and so thus she was able to illustrate her climb up the social ladder by including her mother's titles as well as hers. So men, just like women, seem to stress a relationship to their father. Unlike women, however, men stress the hereditary nature of their temple titles by including oftentimes duplicate titles for fathers, grandfathers, sometimes great-grandfathers, and even in one instance, a great-great-grandfather. Sons are also occasionally mentioned, showing the hereditary titles to be passed down to the next generation. So this excerpt from the Papyrus of Padiamun is a clear example of hereditary titles and family growth through the generations. All 4 men are titled as a god's father and a chief of secrets with various qualifications. But Padiamun's father is also a Hemnetra priest, and this title is passed on to Padiamun himself. In addition, Padiamun secured the prestigious position of opener of the doors, great seer, and Setem priest, meaning he had the additional privilege of seeing and interacting with the gods during the daily offering ritual. The improvement of titles occurs on several papyri of high-status men, where the father is listed with fewer titles of a lower rank. And rather than focus on the lower origins of the family, the emphasis here, I believe, is placed on the deceased being able to improve his social status by his own merit and talent in a traditional Egyptian motif, right, of achieving more than one's parents. So, unlike men who stress the inheritance of specific temple titles and the social rank that accompanies it, women only stress the hereditary nature of their family's status. Even high-ranking women with strongly differentiated titles do not reference their mothers as having those same titles, even when we know this was the case. No men list the titles of their mother, despite 24 mothers being listed by name only. And there are 30 mothers listed by name on women's papyri, with only 3 being provided titles. And we saw one example of that with Tayu Herit earlier. So we have already seen that men tend to focus on the hereditary nature of their titles with an emphasis on their fathers. And women, too, also focus on the status of the men in their lives, with 19 papyri featuring temple titles of fathers and husbands. It is here that I believe we can speak to the decorum of providing titles on funerary papyri. The obvious primary way to compete socially, both while alive and in death, is by referencing one's own titles, and the titles of the deceased do take clear precedence in funerary papyri. But beyond that, there's a noticeable trend for both men and women to utilize the titles of male family members to gain social prestige. There's an almost complete absence of mothers being presented with titles, and this is surprising when many women did share those positions with their mothers. One final point here is the observational unimportance of spouses of both men and women. For women in particular, one might assume that a relationship to a husband would be important, but it is not reflected in the papyri as such. it seems little emphasis was placed on marital relationships in the papyri, and this might be due to the new freedoms afforded women in the 21st dynasty regarding their independent burials on equal status to men that I have discussed in other publications. Now, for this portion of my talk, I wish to highlight 13 individuals that I will refer to as pseudo-royal. And I choose this term, pseudo-royal, here because these individuals, although claiming royal titles and or royal lineage, were not acknowledged outside themselves and their inner circle as being a legitimate ruler of Egypt. While the concept of royalty is one intrinsically tied to family lineage, the royalty, quote unquote, of the 21st dynasty was linked to the highest of the elite status in the temple, and the authority of these individuals arguably derived from the temple rather than any perceived claimed royal blood. The individuals making royal claims hold the highest positions within the temple, namely the high priest of Amun, and all others following in this royal pattern are connected to the high priest in some way. So, for example, Tashed Khans, a female relative of the family of the high priest of Amun, makes the claim on her funerary papyri that she's a descendant of Seti I. And Henetawi A, the wife of the high priest Penejum I, stressed her royal lineage as a granddaughter of Ramses XI. And this royal lineage could have been the reason why Penejum I married Henetawi in the first place. And interestingly, Henetawi equipped herself with royal insignia, such as the cartouche, and using royal titles well before her husband did. So there are two important observations to be made with these individuals, both of which are based on a division between provenances. The first is that while both individuals from Bab el-Ghazous and the Royal Cache and Metropolitan Museum of Art tombs make royal claims, only individuals from the Royal Cache MMA tombs do so with formal titles. Individuals from Bab el-Ghazous reference the specific person to which they are related and do not express such relationships in formal titles. The individuals from the Royal Cache MMA tombs express such relationships by both listing family members and using formal titles. And these formal titles do not always provide the actual name of the relative. So, for example, Nauni uses the title of daughter of the king, but she does not say who the king is. And so it must have been at the time of her burial, Nauni's social status and identity must have been so well known that no clarification seemed necessary. So it would be like today, someone referencing Prince William and someone asking, well, what is he the prince of? In addition, it should be noted that by being buried in the Royal Cache and MMA tombs, one was building a direct physical connection to the royalty of Egypt's most recent past, and this connection would have been well noted by the Theban elite. So finally, I want to address three true cases of deification of 21st dynasty personages, Nessi Khonsu A, Penejum II, and Jedptah Ankh, as preserved in their deification decrees included in their burial assemblages. The first observation I find of interest is the apparent unimportance of titles for the deceased on these documents as compared to other funerary papyri of their assemblages. This surprised me, as it seems to go against everything that I just said during the first half of my talk regarding the importance of showcasing titles for the purpose of maintaining families' social status. However, it seems with these deification decrees, the deceased has transcended the importance of his or her own temple titles. But what hasn't changed, however, is the importance of listing family members on these documents. And this, I believe, speaks not just generally to wanting to maintain family status, but also the very real and practical inheritance of funerary equipment, because all three of these individuals exhibit coffin sets that were heavily reused. And Karakuni has argued in the case of Nessi Khonsu A that her deification decree was intended primarily to appease her deceased self so that her family could continue to reuse her funerary equipment without any retribution from the hereafter, right? And I think she does so very successfully. And this is precisely what I mean by having the more mundane or practical reasons for deifying one's ancestors. These examples and the previous examples of ancestor veneration that I provided shows the legitimation and justification by the family in terms of controlling material possessions as well as elevating the family's social status by having a deified or venerated relative. It quite nicely kills two birds with one stone. So thank you for your time and attention.
So much as well. It was a really interesting talk, and
Thank
you
you.
have many questions here as well. Well, first there was somebody asking, where were most of the paper papyri found?
Yes, so everything that I'm dealing with in my data set is from Thebes generally, and obviously we are on the West Bank here. The largest group is from a cache called the Bab el-Ghazous cache, and there were several hundred papyri found in that location. And then elsewhere, others smaller caches like Theban Tomb 320 and the Metropolitan Museum of Art excavations, several tombs in that area. And then, of course, there's always a large portion, and in my case, about 1/3 of my data set that is unprovenanced, but we assume that it is also the Theban West Bank as well.
Much. And then there's another question from Dr. Julia Troch. Really interesting. Can't help but want to draw parallels to what I observed going on at the end of the Old Kingdom into the first intermediate period. Shifts to temple-based power structures and emphasis on non-royal alternatives to prestige and afterlife privileges. Question now. Do you know if these trends in papyri are reflected in the relatives depicted in tomb scenes or others, funerary, non-funerary, artifact corpora? And then she explains more. Meaning, is 21st dynasty posthumous ancestral social capital being articulated in this papyri in ways similar to how social capital is being articulated in either other funerary corpora or in materials of the living? Might be an unfair question.
No, I don't think it's an unfair question. I think it's a very good question. Yeah, so I think absolutely during times of crisis and decentralization, I think we see these cognitive shifts on, if I am an elite family member, right? If I'm trying to maintain my social status, or if I see an opportunity for social climb, right? During these times where traditional avenues of maintaining one's social status or being part of that in crowd, let's say, are absent. So if there's a weakening of the kingship, if there's a decline in the prestige and the economic gain that palace positions have, right? I think people are going to get creative. I think one great way is to utilize the existing religious system, right? And these temple complexes are incredibly powerful already, right, in terms of economic and political power. So it makes sense to then turn your attention to those types of institutions that you think maybe have a stronger longevity during these times of crisis. So I think that that's what we see happening. And absolutely, in the end of the Old Kingdom into the first intermediate period, we see the same types of shifts occur. And I think that's just, almost a common sense way of the elite to try to preserve themselves, right, during these time periods. In terms of what we see, so the reason why I'm looking at papyri is essentially because other than the papyri and the coffins, right, that's basically what we have in terms of funerary materiality in the 21st dynasty. But I would definitely say that a little bit earlier in the Ramessid period, and I referenced this in the beginning of my talk when I looked at the decorated tomb chambers and tomb chapel areas, we see the shift starting already, right? Where there's more of an emphasis on the family, in various tomb scenes, both living and deceased relatives, so relatives that have previously passed versus then, children being depicted on tomb walls, presumably to maintain the cult of the deceased. So we see that trend already starting in the Ramessid period, which is interestingly still a time of like relative stability in kingship. But I think that what we're witnessing is the elites recognizing that those cracks are already starting. I don't know if that's necessarily a good answer to a very good question, right? Because of the fragmentary nature of what we're dealing with. I wish that we had, 21st dynasty decorated tombs as well, right? That we could then compare to the Ramessid material. So I know I'm taking kind of a shift in the material corpus in terms of what I have available for study.
Some other question as well. Mrs. Sheikh Islami says, "Thank you for your interesting paper, Marissa. Is there any significance to the fact that the deification decrees all involved the family of Masaharta?"
I saw that. I thought of that. I hate to make any types of claims about them because there are three, right? And so what can you really say in terms of patterns and trends when you only have three? And one of them, the one of Jed Ptah Ankh, is not very well known and published, and I wish I had like photos of that one, right? So I'm relying on some scant material. I hate to make any types of grand claims saying like, oh, this is maybe something that was an agenda being pushed by the family for whatever reason. I hate to say that, but it would be very interesting.
And I've got a question for you as well, a comment mostly. Well, you said about the title of the daughter of the king without mentioning who's the king. I have to observe, if I'm not mistaken, that normally the king is not mentioned, whether on like the Sat Nisu title or the Sanisu title in previous periods as
Right.
well. So it's mostly a title rather than like to state that they're like a son or daughter of a particular person.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Why did you mention that particularly here? Is it something in that context particularly that kind of puzzles us, since the king's name is not there?
I mean, I think it's just because we have both formulations during this time period, right? So we have the people that are choosing to list their relatives, like you said, in the son or daughter of, right, formula. And then also through the standard titles that we get, right, where you mentioned that normally the specific person isn't mentioned in those cases. We have some people that do both, right? So they're using formal titles and then they're also providing a standard genealogy. And so I just think it's an interesting distinction to make, that first of all, the choice to go for a formal title or not. In what cases do people think they have that level of closeness or that level of social status that they can use those types of formal titles versus a standard genealogy listing? Why might they choose to do a combination of both, or why might they feel somehow restricted from using a more formal title, right? I think it's an interesting distinction to make in terms of perhaps the genealogical closeness or the status of that particular person at the time of his or her death, as to whether or not they think that they can use those types of formal titles. So that's all I mentioned about that. Not that her specific usage of that title was in any way strange, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. It does. Thank you very, very much. And we have another question as well from Ron Shields. So, great presentation, he says. Where can I read a paper on this for reference? Anything in reference?
So I have an article in CRE, the current research in Egyptology. I think that was published in 2018, I want to say, that goes into some of these connections. I also have one there's an edited volume called Invisible Archaeologies, where I have one that goes into some of the discussion of family and titles as well.
Thank you so much again. Now, just stay with us for a minute, just because we're checking whether we have like questions from our audience here. Is that okay?
Okay, of course.
All right.
Yes,
So we're checking, and like stay with us a bit.
absolutely.
So there's no further questions from our audience. So thank you very, very much. I personally found your lecture really, really interesting because it's kind of close to
Oh,
what I've done. So, all the best for your further study and your further like research. Thank you very much for tonight, and I'll just have to say goodbye. And
yes.
thanks again.
Yes, thank you so much to everyone. I really appreciated the opportunity.